I am Jason Graves, and great video games are timeless, but they're also a product of their time. Well, I'd consider this game great. It's strange that Final Fantasy V doesn't check either box. Quizzoxically, it almost wasn't a product of the time in more ways than one. For starters, the game itself is somewhat of a return to the NES era. That and its release status outside of Japan both give this game a sense of a detached identity. Most of the time video games, or any other media for that matter, are at their most relevant when they're first released. I can go back and play all the Super Nintendo RPGs I want, but it's not the same thing as being there, because I wasn't. By the time America got to play this, they were in the same boat I find myself in with everything on the console. To some, this could have been the elusive missing Final Fantasy that they might have read about in magazines before the rug was pulled out from under them in the form of Mystic Quest. To me, it always was, and always will be, just another game in my ROMs folder. If you're a particularly eagle-eyed viewer, you may have noticed two things already. Firstly, that the footage that you're seeing is from the PlayStation edition, and not the Super Nintendo's, and that I went slightly out of release order for the last few titles in this series. The reason for the latter is simple. I liked the juxtaposition formed by doing Mystic Quest and 5 back to back. You have what many would call the most mechanically rich, complex playing Final Fantasy, being essentially replaced in their foreign release canon by a game whose philosophy couldn't have been more radically opposed. As for the PlayStation, when making these, I'll default to playing the official American release. If it doesn't exist, then I have to ask myself what the closest thing could have been. I had three choices: a fan-translated SNES ROM, an official PlayStation release, and the Game Boy Advance port. I threw the last option out immediately because it's more on the remake or remaster side of the spectrum. The PlayStation version has a few quality of life improvements, such as adding a run button, but all in all, it appeared to be a Super Nintendo ROM dumped onto a PlayStation disc. While there is no doubt that there are quote-unquote better ways to play Final Fantasy V, my decision was absolute. I would experience it the same way I would have were I 15 years older. The localization itself is shockingly bad, to the point where I'm stunned that Square was capable of this in a post-Final Fantasy VII world. It seems Square has always struggled to put the time and care that these re-releases deserve. That's right, after Final Fantasy VII, 1999, this was a retro throwback before it was cool. It's fitting, in a roundabout way, that 5 came after 7, because the game itself feels like it was made out of order. For all the new ground Final Fantasy IV broke, 5 feels more like a follow-up to the NES trilogy. If you were to detach the title screens and ask me to guess which order these games were made, I'd probably incorrectly swap 4 and 5. Or then again, maybe not. I'll acknowledge that graphically, 5 at least looks more advanced than 4. This was the last entry headed by series creator Sakaguchi. It brings back motifs from the earlier games, like having 2 world maps, 2 sets of crystals. It's the most representative old Final Fantasy, as in if you had to choose one game to represent what the franchise was like before 7, this would have to be the pick. It has the party customization of the original in 3, as well as the emphasis on characters seen in 2, 4, and 6. One cannot mention Final Fantasy V without 2 words: system and job. It lifts this from Final Fantasy III, who lifted it from Dragon Quest III, who lifted it from Dungeons & Dragons. The key in this instance is how different jobs aren't treated as completely different characters when you change on a whim. Previously, your learned skills and acquired stats wouldn't transfer from role to role. 3 had a cooldown period where you wouldn't be able to use the skills of a certain class until you had fought a number of enemies. And when you switched it, it was as if the character had forgotten everything they had been doing their entire lives. The difference here in 5 is that you can train a white mage then switch them into something more useful offensively, and still keep the ability to cast white magic. The game gives you 4 party members almost from the start, and they stay there. Even when someone dies, no one's ever really gone. They know the plot doesn't matter, and it's played into. There's a lot of silly stuff, like the infamous Splinter, or anything Gilgamesh does. In the narrative, his personality trait is that he's a stupid idiot that says bizarre things while you kick his ass. The attempted humor is a series first. Heck, the main character's name apparently literally translates to butts. Not to say that the plot doesn't have its moments, there are some fun character interactions, and the theme of mankind working their natural resources to exhaustion is both present and effective to boot. But when you take a step back, when anyone remembers this game, those aren't the things that come to mind. They'll think of Gilgamesh's theme song, but not of the character. They'll reminisce about the job system, but not about how Butts was scared of heights. The things that make Final Fantasy V its own aren't story related. There's some creative boss fights, such as the guy who sucks your party into a portal, or the bit where you need to separate your team in 2 so you can fight dual enemies simultaneously, but I can't help but feel that they're hampered in a way by the player's freedom. In 4, they could design fights knowing exactly who and what skills you had access to, but here, you could be packing anything. It feels like most encounters are easily broken by a good time mage summoner combo, especially in the mid to late game. As an aside, I don't like how the monk sucks. It's my favorite class normally, but for some reason they nerfed him. They just don't do enough damage. I mastered Monk, and all I had to show for it was a nice HP boost and a character who only hit for 500 damage a punch. It was my understanding that the universal law of JRPGs stated that whoever hits things with their fist does the most damage. I really like the world fusing together. You might think that there's an abnormal amount of water, but it never crossed my mind that they were both parts to a whole. When they come together, now that's a legitimate moment. Honestly, I'm having trouble thinking of things to say. There's a reason 5 isn't as discussed as most other Final Fantasies. And I don't think it's because the game wasn't originally released here, nay, but because there's not as much meat on these bones. It has a great reputation, is often called underrated and overlooked. Overlooked is apt, but it also is for a reason. Being a blend of the older games gives it less of an identity to call its own. There's not a great deal going on. It does not have the same kind of innovation as the entries that came before, nor does it have the complex narratives and themes of the entries that would come later. I feel pressure, not from anybody watching, but from myself, to make my Final Fantasy V video. One of the long ones, jam-packed with a lot of ideas, but they're just not coming to me. I genuinely like the game. It's probably my favorite from the first 5. It's good, but I see why this one slips through the cracks. For example, a modern Final Fantasy player doesn't have much cause to come back to this one. If you're a general retro gamer, it might not be on your radar because it wasn't released outside of Japan. So who does that leave us with? There's people like me who specifically play old RPGs, and Final Fantasy diehards. Those are the people who are going to remember, the ones who are going to talk about this game, and largely they already have. There's a bevy of content about this game. It's hardly forgotten, but it's also not quick to come off the tongue. I think its place in history is accurate. A great game for what it is. It just so happens that what this is a well-made game without a strong identity. Remember, never trust anyone who needs a haircut. Good night.